Hello, everyone. Thank you for looking at this video. So we are here. We just finished the plenary session on hybrid markets. So how to create a market where you have both operational optimal dispatch, while at the same time you send right investment signals. With me is Jan Horst Keppler from Université Paris Dauphine. In the panel, we had David Newberry from University Cambridge, Michael Grubb from UCL, Fluvio Fontini from Université di Padova, and Fabien Roch from Compass Lexicon and Dauphine. So Jan Horst Keppler, a very interesting discussion we had about, I think, a topic that will remain in the attention of academics and the wider public in the years to come. So my first question, or rather remark to you, would be that it seems that there is a consensus among academics that this hybrid market is something that we need. With the hybrid market, as you explained, it's a short-term kind of optimal dispatch kind of market, plus some additional compensation, which is transparent and predictable in order to push investment. Now, this is something rather new, I would say, because maybe 5 or 10 years ago in academic circles, this idea of the energy-only market was still very much, let's say, the paradigm. So how did we come so far that it's in our academic community somehow accepted to think about these hybrid markets?
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting question, which is, of course, at the heart of sort of our thinking about these things as academics. Let's go back a little bit in time, and I will try to argue that we have several evolutions that are ongoing to some extent independent from each other that interact in that debate. When we moved away from sort of the regulatory paradigm in the late 1980s, 1990s, I just recall the works by Paul Josko, by David Newberry, who was here, by Stoff and others. What was sort of the dominant new technology? That was the combined cycle gas turbine. And gas turbine combined cycle has capital costs of 10 to 20%, probably closer to 10%, depending, of course, on the gas price of its total cost. So it's fairly capital light, at least compared to a coal plant, compared to a nuclear plant. But and so with that sort of the idea, the energy-only market will sort of pay for high variable costs, and then we sort of need to play in a little bit of added missing money through a limited number of scarcity hours with vol pricing. That sort of seemed it could work, and on paper it works perfectly, and theoretically, conceptually, the paradigm is very sound. And you also had some problems, the old regulatory model, corporate slack, sort of a lack of technological dynamism and all that. But then sort of basically little later comes a big policy commitment to decarbonize the electricity sector. And no chance, if you want to decarbonize, you need very, very capital intensive technologies. Whichever low carbon technology you look at, renewables, nuclear, hydro, even renewable, even batteries, are very, very capital intensive. So all of a sudden, the energy only market system, which is basically a system where variable costs or set prices, looks a lot more fragile, because the huge capital costs, also issues of uncertainty, risk, and also come in, all of a sudden seem, how should I say, less convincing. But in the meantime, sort of the whole intellectual discussion had sort of spilled over into regulatory circles, into policymaking circles. So the whole institutional infrastructures for the energy-only markets is being set up at the very moment when they become slightly less relevant, or a lot less relevant indeed. And then, of course, you have the whole renewable issues. Almost independent of the contribution to carbon emission reductions, people want a lot of variable renewables. Now, variable renewables are not only the most capital-intensive technology that we have, it also has the autocorrelation issue. That means all the wind turbines turn at the same time. All the solar panels produce electricity between 10 o'clock in the mornings and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, at least in most parts of Europe. So during those periods, then prices are very low. So renewables have this added issue that sustaining them on an energy-only market is very, very difficult. So then what has been done in parallel to putting in the energy-only markets, subsidies feed-in tariffs, long-term contracts out of the market for renewables were created on a rather massive scale. And then, of course, the two don't mix at all. We have the very low prices in the energy-only market because we have to some extent oversupply. Adjustments are very long term because the investment cycles are very long term. So we're somewhere in an tension between, on the one hand, a fascinating, interesting conceptual paradigm, and a reality of decarbonation that doesn't really fit with that paradigm. And I think then the discussion has been moving on, and as Fabian has said, hybrid markets have been around for some time, and not only for renewables. Nuclear is getting a contract for difference. We're now talking about a regulated asset-based model in the UK. Hydro in many countries receives some sort of long-term contract. So I think it's more sort of that different considerations in that context are coming together under this heading of hybrid markets. And we're now at the point where we're saying, wait a minute, the energy-only market short-term pricing model is probably, or certainly not enough, at least, but it also has some real merits. It's very good at using existing assets. And efficient dispatch has certainly brought a lot of gains in terms of consumer surplus to European consumers, but it's not sufficient, and it's not very good on the investment side. And we need to come up with something else on the investment side. And now we're at that point, and I think the session brought out very clearly, what exactly should that something else should be. And there's a range, of course, between Fulvio, who's more thinking we can do that with sort of creating the right forward markets. Michael, who says we need to create markets for long-term provision. David, who's recalled the regulated asset-based model, and also recalled, we didn't come back to that in the discussion, that we probably should review our support schemes for renewables. People like renewables, it's a policy objective, fine, but supporting output for renewables when we least need it is probably not the right idea, and supporting capacity is probably, from an economic point of view, a much more coherent approach. But there we are, and we're not done yet, and it's definitely an area of research rather than sort of a new, fully fleshed out paradigm, and might never will be, because it lacks the sort of a fascinating conceptual coherence that convinced a lot of people of the energy-only market model. But I think we need to sort of create a few sort of reference points in that discussion that will then give, in the concrete context of different countries and different systems, sort of some guiding principles for choosing the right complementary mechanism to ensure adequate investment.
Yeah, and so a very nice historical account of where we were and how we got to where we are today. So it's say also sort of a lag between technology policy development and then the whole market design discussion and the legislative framework around it. Fabien indeed had this very interesting slide where he showed that actually, if you look back, the majority of investment has been happening under some side of additional support, whether it was regulated in the older days, whether it was the capacity markets or mechanism, whether it was renewable subsidies or other approaches. So my last question would be that, do you think that these hybrid markets are something to stay? Or do you think that we can fix all the problems that we have been debating out in the last 20 years, the missing money, missing markets, the role of the consumer, in order to somehow arrive back to this energy market only when we somehow get used to how to deal with renewables and their capex and so on? Or is it some academic utopia that we never reach?
No, it's an interesting question, and I'll tell you right away my personal prejudice, but I don't want to sort of put my personal prejudice on a pedestal and say this is the only possible outcome. I think we will not arrive at making energy only markets work by patches. Basically, adding sort of a little bit of a capacity mechanism here, some demand flexibility there, some reform of support mechanisms for one technology or the other. However, you're absolutely right on one point. The need for turning towards hybrid markets is, of course, ultimately also dependent on the well-known fact that electricity is a good that is very difficult to store. We wouldn't have the same discussion if electricity was just another commodity that we could sort of produce in advance and then use when needed. So now some people talk about batteries. I think batteries are very expensive for the time being, and the longer we go out, they might be very good in sort of the second and minute sort of balancing of the grid, but they're much less of a viable solution when we go out towards days, weeks, or even seasons, because we have a lot more wind in the winter and a lot more sun in the summer. So that seasonal balancing is a big issue. Then you say it's not only batteries; it could be also demand side response. Yes, to some extent, if we had fully flexible demand, then again, a lot of the issues that we were discussing might go away. We might have demand response coming in at 300, 400 euros per megawatt hour, and the problems would be a lot less severe. Again, I think demand response will probably help at the edges, especially industrial long-term contracts. However, let me say immediately, again, this is not a technology that comes without fixed cost. You will have some sizable fixed costs also for industrial demand response. It's not by coincidence that it's currently remunerated exclusively by long-term contracts with the system operator. So it will not solve all issues. And quite frankly, I'm very skeptical on residential demand response. Of course, you have water heaters that can be regulated from afar for a degree or two without any loss of utility. That might work, and that depends then on the country. It's a big source of flexibility here in France, where there's a lot of electric heating. Other countries have other systems, so the resource is somewhat less available. Ultimately, it's a race, I think, between decarbonization, and then that means more capital-intensive technologies, and sort of added flexibility, better management, and all that. So if we would stay here at 20-30% of variable renewables, and with sort of not too ambitious objectives in decarbonization, I would say, well, maybe Tim has a point, and demand response and batteries and some reform.
Hydrogen.
Pardon?
Hydrogen, as some people are advocating.
Let's not talk about hydrogen. It's a very, very difficult issue on its own, and there's rarely it belongs to those particular issues in energy where a lot of myth substitute for fact right now.
And it has its own session in the conference also. So.
Right. I'll let the speakers deal with it. Let me just really finish on that point. I think there's a race between increasingly ambitious decarbonation, increasingly shares of renewables, which make it more and more difficult to square the investment question, and the issues, batteries, flexibility, that you mentioned. And so we do need, I'm convinced of that, as we move towards net zero, we need hybrid markets in order to ensure that we have sufficient amount of dispatchable low carbon energy available in the electricity system. But it's not a black or white question. It's really a question, how ambitious do we want to be in terms of decarbonization? And if it's net zero, then we need something else than energy only. There's no doubt about it. It's a question of how much flexibility resources do we have? We have some, but not infinite amount, and they come at a cost. So ultimately, I'm convinced if we stay with net zero, hybrid markets are here to stay.
Because we need to get there and we need to be fast. So that also matters. So thank you very much, Jan Horst, for your reflections, for this interview in the slipstream of this very interesting plenary session. So thank you. And I would say see you around in the next days on the conference.
Absolutely. Tim, thank you very much. And as you said, see you around.